What's up, Suns Army? Darth Pascal here. Thanks for tuning in to part 2 of the most disappointing games of the decade. Today, we will be doing numbers 5 through 1. As a quick review, we are not doing any games that started off disappointing and then got better after launch. Those are a list for another day. If there is a game you think we missed on our list, leave a comment down below or watch our previous video. We might have talked about it there. The most disappointing games of the decade, 5 through 1, let's jump right in. Lost Planet 2 is one of the earliest games on our list, released all the way back in 2010. The original Lost Planet is one of my favorite original Xbox 360 games. It offered great third-person shooting, incredible mech action, and an engaging but very Japanese story. The sequel, Lost Planet 2, said, you know what? Let's make the entire game co-op and make playing single-player virtually impossible. Oh, and you know everything people liked about the original multiplayer? Let's throw that out the window too and just make a Gears of War clone. As an American playing this game primarily with international players, the campaign introduced an interesting language barrier to the point where I just said, screw it, I'm playing by myself. It didn't go well, and neither did the game. Brink was released in 2011, right on the heels of Skyrim. Brink was also being published by Bethesda and promised engaging co-op, intense multiplayer, topped with an interesting setting. The best part of all was a free-flowing parkour mechanic that seemed revolutionary at the time. Once again, nothing worked. Frame rate dips, glitches, and horrible matchmaking crushed this game's hope of ever having success. Pretty much the only thing that worked for this game was the parkour mechanics. Even that feature seemed useless though. So I guess it's clear that Bethesda started off this decade with some bombs and couldn't fail up until Fallout 76. After a rough stretch of games at the end of the decade, let's hope that Bethesda starts off this upcoming decade with some strong games like Starfield and Elder Scrolls 6. At number 3, it's not just one game but a collection of games. To me, pretty much every game Telltale made after Season 1 of The Walking Dead was a disappointment. After winning numerous Games of the Year award in 2012, Telltale failed to build or innovate off the success of The Walking Dead. If you compare the gameplay of Walking Dead Season 1 to the last season, and ironically the last game they made, the gameplay is almost identical and the story is no longer interesting and engaging. Telltale, instead of making fewer games at a higher quality, decided to put out the same game just with a new intellectual property year after year. Games that included Borderlands, Game of Thrones, Guardians of the Galaxy, Batman, and even Minecraft. This ultimately led to not only lower sales, but also the closing of Telltale itself. At the start of the decade, they were a young developer making small yet enjoyable story-based games, but due to greedy executives and poor business management, Telltale closed their doors in 2018 and sold off their remaining assets. Homefront The Revolution is a disappointment I should have seen coming. It bounced around in development hell before finally being released in 2016. Moving around from developer to developer and even publisher to publisher, it showed an early sign this game would be lacking quality upon release. Despite the clear warning signs, here is why I and many other people were excited. Although the game did change developers, during the Switch it was announced that the game would now run on the Crytek engine, an engine held for its graphical fidelity and fluidity. It was now being published by Deep Silver, who had published an underrated FPS game called Metro Last Light. One other small detail, it was announced that the game would take place in my hometown, Philadelphia. I was excited to roam through the streets of the city I grew up right outside of. To that point, I had never done this before in a video game. The original game, released in 2011, was a breath of fresh air. To me, it was extremely underrated. The multiplayer blended the best parts of Call of Duty and Battlefield together. The single player, while being linear, told an original story, all taking place in a breathtakingly recreated San Francisco. The abrupt end of the story had me excited for a sequel no matter the signs. When Homefront The Revolution finally released in 2016, every promise they made, they broke. One thing they stated that stayed true was that at launch this game would not feature an online multiplayer component. Instead, they relied heavily on single-player gameplay and added a little bit of online co-op. However, nothing worked. They had shucked the linear-based levels of the original for a boring and bland open world that did not even feature the landmarks that make Philadelphia such an iconic city. Not to mention, the graphics looked like they belonged on the previous generation. The muddy textures and frame rate dips that would make an N64 look good. The story was poorly told and seemed like an impossibility, whereas the other game was grounded within reality. All that in mind, I still would have played all the way through this game despite how poor of a sequel it was, but the constant glitches and infuriating AI made me shut this game off and never return to it. I'll leave you with this, a clip of what I can remember being my last experience with the game. I had a good laugh, shut the game off, and never returned.
Faces full bastard's leg. Sound good? I don't think so.
Bad, you fucker! Oh my God! Ah, so bad, you idiot! God!
Before we move on to number 1, let's take a moment to look back at some games that you guys found disappointing or I thought were disappointing but not enough to make the list. Anthem promised great co-op jetpack shooting, we got a repetitive, boring third-person shooter. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5 promised to be a return to roots. It was a return to glitchy and dated gameplay. Aliens Colonial Marines lied to the entire world and got sued because of it. And Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite sucked. You might have clicked on this video thinking number 1 was going to be a completely different game, and my guess is you didn't suspect what number 1 was going to be. To me personally, the most disappointing game of the decade has to be The Force Unleashed 2. Don't get me wrong, I didn't hate this game, but to me it's so disappointing because of the promise the game had and what followed this game. To that point, outside of Bethesda and Bungie, LucasArts was my favorite developer/publisher ever. This game wasn't a bad game, but it was a disappointment in itself. The story was terrible, the gameplay made almost no advances from the original, it was extremely easy even on the hardest difficulty, and it only took about 5 hours to beat this game. Poor sales led to a third game in the series being cancelled. Then, everything changed when the Disney buyout happened. This signaled the end of LucasArts. Not only did part of my childhood die, but it looked like LucasArts was going to get back to their original form and release great games. Instead, what we got was 2 good Star Wars games for the entire decade, instead of having 2 good Star Wars games per year. Part of the blame goes to Force Unleashed 2 for being such a disappointing game, both in quality and financially. Sons Army, thanks for sticking with me. Look out for a bonus video hopefully coming later this week. If you're a Star Wars fan, you'll be excited as I count down the best Star Wars games of all time. Comment down below what games you found disappointing this decade. If you don't mind, drop a like. I have to feed my children. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We've got a lot more disappointing videos coming at you. Wait, that's not what I meant. Anyways, subscribe and we'll see you next time.